Human history explained simply. Welcome. If you found this video, you're probably the kind of person who lies awake wondering how we got here, how a species that once huddled around fires, not knowing if they'd eat tomorrow, ended up building the world you see outside your window. This channel exists for exactly that kind of curiosity. No textbooks, no exams, just the most fascinating story ever told, the story of us. So get comfortable. This one takes a while, and it's worth it. From hunter-gatherers to the world we live in. Intro: The strangest success story. Look around you, cities stretching to the horizon, satellites orbiting the planet, a device in your pocket containing more information than entire ancient civilizations could store in 1,000 years of writing. Now here's the strange part. None of this was planned. Human history isn't a straight line of progress. It's a series of accidents, experiments, catastrophic mistakes, and surprising, sometimes baffling, successes. For most of our existence, humans didn't build cities. We didn't write laws. We didn't own land. We simply survived, and we were pretty good at it. So how did we go from small groups of people walking across open landscapes, carrying everything they owned, to a global civilization of 8 billion people that has reshaped the planet itself? And more importantly, what does that journey reveal about us today? To understand the modern world, we have to start at the very beginning. Not with kings or empires, not with war or religion, but with something far simpler. A fire, a story, a family. Part 1. Life before everything. For most of human history, there were no buildings, no roads, no borders, no money. Humans lived as hunter-gatherers, and they did so for a staggering length of time. To put it in perspective, if all of human history were compressed into a single 24-hour day, agriculture would only arrive in the last 90 minutes, writing in the last 12. The Industrial Revolution, the last 30 seconds. We are, in almost every biological sense, still those people walking across ancient landscapes. Life was simple, but never easy. Food decided everything. If animals migrated, you followed. If plants stopped growing, you moved. Staying in one place too long was dangerous. You'd strip the land bare and starve. Groups were small, usually between 20 and 150 people. The anthropologist Robin Dunbar proposed, controversially, that 150 is roughly the cognitive limit of stable social relationships the human brain can track. Whether or not his exact number holds up, the basic insight rings true. We evolved for small, close-knit groups where everyone knows everyone. In these small bands, there were no kings because there was nothing to rule. No police because survival depended on cooperation. If someone hoarded food, the group suffered. If someone refused to help, the group remembered. Social pressure kept order, not laws, not armies, just the weight of everyone else's judgment. And here's something that consistently surprises people. Many hunter-gatherer societies were remarkably egalitarian. Not perfectly equal, there were respected elders, skilled hunters, wise healers. But the brutal hierarchies we associate with later civilizations, those mostly came later. Studies of modern hunter-gatherer groups still living traditionally, the San people of the Kalahari, the Hadza of Tanzania, show patterns of active equality maintenance. If someone gets too big for their boots, the group brings them back down to size. Anthropologists call it leveling, and it's remarkably consistent across cultures that never had contact with each other. Here's another counterintuitive fact. Many hunter-gatherers had more free time than modern humans. The anthropologist Marshall Solins called hunter-gatherer societies the original affluent society. Studies of the San people found that gathering food took roughly 15 to 20 hours a week. though the total picture is more complicated once you include food preparation and other camp tasks. Still, by most estimates, they worked considerably less than the average modern worker. No alarms, no deadlines, no quarterly performance reviews. Life was dangerous. Disease, predators, injury could kill you quickly. But it wasn't relentlessly rushed in the way modern life often is. Now, fire. The control of fire is one of the most transformative events in human evolution, and it happened far earlier than most people realize. Evidence of controlled fire use goes back at least 400,000 years, possibly closer to 1 million. Fire cooked food, which matters more than it sounds. Raw meat and vegetables are hard to digest. Cooking breaks down proteins and starches, releasing more calories, and those extra calories fed growing brains. Some researchers argue that cooking is literally what made us human, that the expansion of the human brain over hundreds of thousands of years was powered, in a very direct sense, by fire. Fire also extended the day. Suddenly, the dangerous dark hours became social hours. It created warmth in cold climates, opening new territories. It was a weapon against predators. But perhaps most importantly, fire gave people a place to gather. Around fires, humans talked. They shared stories. They warned each other about dangers. They explained the world. They laughed. Language itself likely evolved in this context. Here's a thought that changed how many anthropologists think about human nature. Language may not have evolved primarily for sharing information. It may have evolved for social bonding, for gossip in the deepest sense of the word. Anthropologist Robin Dunbar argues that language replaced the physical grooming that other primates use to build relationships. You can only groom one animal at a time, but you can tell a story to 10 people at once. Language was a social technology before it was an intellectual one, and art appeared long before civilization, tens of thousands of years before the first city was built. The oldest known cave paintings are in Sulawesi, Indonesia. In 2024, researchers using new laser dating techniques confirmed that one scene showing human-like figures interacting with a wild pig is at least 51,200 years old. That makes it the oldest known narrative artwork in the world. Older, even, than the famous caves of France and Spain. In France and Spain, the Chauvet and Lascaux caves hold paintings of breathtaking sophistication, horses, bison, rhinoceros, drawn with a confidence and skill that would impress any modern illustrator. Chauvet is around 36,000 years old. Why make art if life is only about survival? Because humans were never just surviving. They were meaning-making. They were asking questions, telling stories, building shared worlds out of words and images and symbols. That impulse, that need to make meaning, is not a luxury addition to human nature. It's close to the core of it. For tens of thousands of years, this way of life worked. So what changed? Why did humans abandon a system that had kept them alive for so long? Part 2. The most important accident. Around 12,000 years ago, something shifted. The last ice age was ending, temperatures were rising, landscapes were changing, and in a handful of places around the world, the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, the Yangtze River Valley in China, the highlands of New Guinea, parts of Africa and the Americas, humans began, independently and almost simultaneously, to do something new. They started farming. At some point, humans noticed something simple. If you drop seeds in disturbed ground, plants grow. If you protect certain animals instead of hunting them, they reproduce. This wasn't a revolution at first. It was barely even a decision. It was an experiment. People still hunted and gathered, but now they also planted. They began to favor the biggest seeded grasses, the tamest animals, the most productive plots of ground. Generation by generation, almost invisibly, they were reshaping the species around them, and those species were reshaping them. Slowly, almost without noticing, this changed everything. Staying near crops meant staying in one place. Staying in one place meant building more permanent shelters. Shelters became homes. Homes became villages. The plants and animals we domesticated are extraordinary stories in themselves. Wheat, rice, maize, barley. Between them, these four crops now cover more land than any other plant on earth and feed most of humanity. They were wild grasses 12,000 years ago. The cow, the pig, the sheep, the goat, the horse. Domesticated in a relatively narrow window between about 10,000 and 6,000 years ago, and now among the most numerous large mammals on the planet precisely because of their relationship with humans. Farming promised stability, but stability came at a price. And this price is one of the most debated topics in archaeology and anthropology. Early farmers worked harder than hunter-gatherers, not less. Their diets were less varied, more calories, yes, but from fewer sources. Evidence from skeletal remains shows early farmers were shorter on average than their hunter-gatherer predecessors, a sign of nutritional stress. Infectious disease exploded. Living close to animals means living close to the diseases animals carry. Measles, smallpox, influenza, all of these likely jumped from domesticated animals to humans. Crowded settlements meant contagion spread fast. So why did farming spread? Because it created surplus. Extra food meant more children survived to adulthood. More surviving children meant larger populations. And farming could support far more people per square mile than hunting and gathering. This is the key dynamic. Farming wasn't necessarily better for the individual farmer, but it was better for the population as a whole, in the cold, statistical sense that more people survived and reproduced. In competition with hunter-gatherer groups, farming societies tended to grow faster and expand outward, not through warfare alone, often just through sheer numbers. Farmers didn't always win every battle, but they kept coming. And as populations grew, new problems emerged. Who decides how food is shared? Who owns the land? Who settles disputes between neighbors? Who leads when the group is too large for everyone to know everyone? Power began to concentrate. In early farming societies, some individuals accumulated more grain, more livestock, more land. This gave them influence. Influence gave them the ability to attract followers. Followers gave them protection and labor. A feedback loop began. Inequality wasn't invented overnight, but farming made it permanent in a way that hunter-gatherer leveling mechanisms couldn't reverse. Some archaeologists argue we can see the moment inequality became entrenched in the burial record. Hunter-gatherer graves are often modest, similar treatment for most individuals. Then, in early agricultural societies, you start seeing graves with dramatically more goods, jewelry, weapons, signs of status, the first aristocracies. This is a pattern you'll see again and again in history. A solution creates a new problem. That problem demands another solution, which creates yet another problem. Villages grew into towns, towns grew into cities, and with cities came something entirely new, civilization. Part 3. When humans built the first cities. The first large cities appeared in Mesopotamia, a Greek word meaning land between the rivers. The Tigris and the Euphrates rivers flow through what is now Iraq, and for thousands of years they flooded regularly, leaving behind thick deposits of rich, dark soil. The land itself was extraordinarily productive. People learned to work with the floods, building irrigation canals, controlling water flow, turning wetlands into farmland. Food production increased dramatically, and as food increased, population increased. Around 4,000 years before the Common Era, cities began to emerge. Uruk, located near the modern Iraqi city of Warqa, grew to perhaps 50,000 people by 3000 BCE. For the ancient world, this was staggering. Most humans alive at that time had never encountered a group larger than a few hundred people. How do you manage strangers? That's the central challenge cities had to solve, and the solutions they invented have shaped human life ever since. The first challenge was simple but profound. Memory is limited. A village elder can remember who owns which field, who borrowed what from whom, who owes grain to the temple. But in a city of tens of thousands, you cannot hold all of that in your head. So humans invented writing. The earliest writing we've found, clay tablets from Uruk, dated to around 3300 BCE, is not poetry. It's not philosophy. It's not prayers. It's accounting. Lists of grain, counts of livestock, records of labor, ration distributions from the temple granary. Writing was born as a bureaucratic technology, a way to extend memory beyond individual human minds. This is one of the most significant inventions in human history, and it was motivated by the entirely practical need to track who owed what to whom. Over centuries, writing expanded. It captured language. It recorded laws. It preserved stories. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest surviving works of literature, written in ancient Sumerian and Akkadian, tells the story of a king who fears death and goes searching for immortality. It contains a flood story strikingly similar to the later Noah narrative in the Bible. It grapples with grief, friendship, the meaning of a life. Someone wrote this down over 4,000 years ago, and we can still read it. Once ideas were written down, they gained a kind of immortality that human memory alone could never provide. Knowledge could survive the death of the person who held it. It could travel. It could accumulate across generations. Laws followed writing. The Code of Hammurabi, created by the Babylonian king Hammurabi around 1750 BCE, is one of the oldest and most complete legal codes ever found. Carved onto a stone stele nearly 8 feet tall, it contains 282 laws covering everything from trade disputes to property rights to the responsibilities of surgeons. It's also notable for containing the famous principle of an eye for an eye, which sounds brutal to modern ears, but in context was actually a step toward proportionality. The punishment should fit the crime, not exceed it. Justice became predictable, but also explicitly unequal. The code applied different punishments depending on your social status. Power claimed divine justification. Kings in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and many other early civilizations presented themselves not just as rulers, but as intermediaries between the human and divine worlds, or in some cases, as gods themselves. The pharaohs of Egypt were considered living manifestations of the god Horus. Temples rose above cities, symbolizing the cosmic order that rulers claimed to maintain. Religion served many purposes: spiritual, philosophical, social, but in early civilizations it also served a very practical political one. It made existing power structures feel natural, eternal, and sacred. Trade expanded. Cities needed things their local environments couldn't provide: metals, timber, certain foods. Trade networks spread across hundreds of miles. The wheel, invented around 3500 BCE in Mesopotamia, or possibly the Eurasian steppe, made overland transport dramatically more efficient. Boats sailed rivers and coastal waters, moving goods that would have been impossible to carry by foot. And with goods moved ideas, techniques, technologies, stories, beliefs, the earliest globalization. But civilization came with costs. Crowded cities spread disease with lethal efficiency. Organized armies made war constant and large-scale. And empires, the next logical step after cities, were extraordinarily fragile. The Akkadian Empire, often called the world's first true empire, collapsed suddenly around 2150 BCE. Evidence suggests a prolonged drought devastated agriculture. Populations fled, cities emptied. The Bronze Age collapse, around 1200 BCE, is one of history's most mysterious catastrophes. Within a few decades, almost every major civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, the late Bronze Age powers of Cyprus and the Levant, collapsed simultaneously. Trade networks fell apart. Writing was lost in some regions. Cities were abandoned. Historians still debate the causes: climate change, earthquakes, drought, invasion, internal revolt, systems collapse, probably some combination of all of them. It's a humbling reminder that civilizations are not inevitable. They can and do fall. Yet something remarkable happened even in collapse. The ideas survived. Writing, mathematics, astronomy, legal codes, agricultural techniques, architectural knowledge. Human knowledge had learned how to outlive the humans who created it. Part 4. Empires, Religions, and the Ancient World in Full Flower. Civilizations didn't just rise and fall, they spread. By the first millennium BCE, complex societies had independently emerged on every inhabited continent: Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, China, Mesoamerica, the Andes. Different environments, different languages, different beliefs, but remarkably similar challenges and strikingly similar solutions. Humans, it seems, keep reinventing the same things. The period between roughly 800 BCE and 200 BCE is sometimes called the Axial Age, a term coined by the German philosopher Karl Jaspers. Within a few centuries, and largely independently, the world produced an astonishing cluster of foundational thinkers. In Greece, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. In China, Confucius, Laozi, Zhuangzi. In India, the Buddha, the authors of the Upanishads. In Persia, Zoroaster. In the Middle East, the Hebrew prophets. These weren't isolated figures. They were responses to a common challenge. As societies grew more complex, more urban, more unequal, how should a person live? What is the good life? What do we owe each other? The answers they came up with still shape billions of lives today. Empires accelerated everything. The Persian Empire at its height stretched from Greece to northern India, the largest empire the world had yet seen. It connected populations that had never before been in contact, creating a vast zone of trade, cultural exchange, and, inevitably, conflict. When Alexander the Great conquered that empire in just over a decade, between 334 and 323 BCE, he did something unprecedented. He dragged Greek culture, language, and ideas across 3 continents. In his wake came cities, libraries, the Greek language as a common tongue of trade and scholarship across a vast area. The Library of Alexandria, built in Egypt under the dynasty that followed Alexander, became perhaps the greatest collection of knowledge the ancient world ever assembled. It attracted scholars from across the Mediterranean world who sat together, argued, translated, and synthesized. Science advanced rapidly. Eratosthenes used shadows and geometry to calculate the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy, using nothing but sticks, the angle of shadows, and the distance between 2 Egyptian cities. His result was impressively close to the modern value. Hipparchus mapped the positions of hundreds of stars and estimated the distance to the moon. Archimedes described the principles of the lever and the screw with mathematical precision. The Roman Empire brought its own transformations. At its peak, Rome governed around 70 million people across 3 continents, roughly a quarter of the world's population. It built roads so durable that some are still walkable today. It created legal frameworks that directly influenced European and American law 2,000 years later. Roman roads didn't just move armies, they moved goods, people, and ideas at a speed that had never been possible before. Christianity, which began as a small Jewish sect in a backwater province of the empire, spread along those roads to become the religion of the empire within 3 centuries. On the other side of the world, China's Han Dynasty was building an empire of comparable scale and sophistication. Paper was invented, iron was smelted at industrial scale. The civil service examination, one of the earliest meritocratic government selection systems in history, laid the groundwork for administrative approaches that would endure for millennia. Trade routes connected these civilizations. The Silk Road, actually a network of routes rather than a single road, stretched from China to Rome. Silk moved west, glass moved east, but alongside goods traveled ideas, religions, technologies, and diseases. Buddhism spread from India to China along these routes. Mathematical concepts, including the numeral system we use today, developed in India, traveled westward. The fall of Rome in the West was slow and complicated, and nothing like the dramatic collapse popular imagination suggests. It was more like a long, gradual transformation. Roman institutions eroded, power fragmented. But Roman law, the Latin language, and above all, the Christian Church, survived and continued shaping European civilization. In the East, the Roman Empire continued as the Byzantine Empire for another 1,000 years, centered in Constantinople. And in the 7th century of the Common Era, a new civilization emerged with startling speed. Islam, founded in Arabia by the Prophet Muhammad, spread within a century from Spain to Central Asia, one of the most rapid expansions of any civilization in history. Under the Abbasid Caliphate, Baghdad became the intellectual capital of the world. The House of Wisdom brought together scholars from across Eurasia to translate, comment on, and extend Greek, Persian, and Indian knowledge. Algebra was developed. Medical encyclopedias were written that remained standard references in European universities for centuries. Astronomical observations of extraordinary precision were made. The so-called Dark Ages of European history were anything but dark on a global scale. While Western Europe was fragmented and recovering from Rome's collapse, the Islamic world, Tang Dynasty China, and the Byzantine Empire were flourishing. Part 5. The World Connects. The medieval period, roughly 500 to 1500 of the Common Era, is often imagined as a long pause between the ancient world and modernity. It was anything but. In 1215, English barons forced King John to sign the Magna Carta, establishing for the first time that a king could be bound by law. It was a crack in the idea of absolute royal power that would widen over the following centuries into modern constitutional government. Universities appeared in Europe, Bologna in 1088, Oxford around 1096, Paris in the early 12th century. For the first time, there were institutions dedicated not just to training clergy, but to the systematic pursuit of knowledge. Then, in the mid-13th century, the Mongols. The Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan and his successors became the largest contiguous land empire in human history, stretching from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe. It was extraordinarily violent. Some estimates suggest the conquests reduced world population by tens of millions. But the Mongol Empire also created something unprecedented, a zone of relative peace and secure trade stretching across Eurasia. This allowed goods, people, and ideas to move across the continent more freely than at any previous time. It also moved something else. In 1347, ships arriving in Sicily from the Black Sea brought a cargo they didn't know they were carrying, the bubonic plague. The Black Death killed between a third and half of Europe's population within a few years. Similar devastation struck the Middle East, Central Asia, and parts of China. It was one of the most catastrophic events in human history, but its long-term consequences were strange and complex. Labor became scarce. Peasants who survived had leverage they'd never had before. Wages rose. Old feudal structures weakened. Social hierarchies that had seemed permanent began to shift. Some historians argue the Black Death was a catalyst for the Renaissance, that the disruption it caused helped set in motion the cultural and intellectual transformation that followed. The Renaissance, beginning in Italy in the 14th and 15th centuries, was a rediscovery and reinterpretation of classical Greek and Roman knowledge, combined with a new emphasis on human experience, individual achievement, and observation of the natural world. Art changed. Perspective was developed, the technique of representing three-dimensional space on a flat surface. Paintings suddenly had depth, faces had psychology. In 1440, Johannes Gutenberg invented the printing press with movable type. This is, without exaggeration, one of the most consequential inventions in human history. Before Gutenberg, producing a single book required months of skilled labor by hand. Books were expensive. Knowledge was largely controlled by institutions, churches, universities, courts that could afford to copy and store manuscripts. After Gutenberg, books became cheap. Within 50 years of the press's invention, printing houses had been established across Europe and around 20 million books had been printed. Ideas could spread faster than rulers could suppress them. Martin Luther's challenge to the Catholic Church in 1517, printed and circulated rapidly, sparked the Protestant Reformation, which permanently fractured Western Christianity and set off a century of religious wars. It's hard to imagine any of this without the printing press. The same technology spread scientific ideas that challenged traditional authority. Copernicus proposed heliocentrism. The Earth goes around the Sun, not vice versa. Galileo provided observational evidence. Kepler described the mathematics of planetary motion. The scientific revolution was underway, and then came 1492. When Columbus arrived in the Caribbean, he connected two halves of the world that had been separated for over 10,000 years. The consequences were immense and extraordinarily brutal. The indigenous populations of the Americas had no immunity to Eurasian diseases. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and other diseases swept through populations that had never encountered them. In some regions, 90% of the pre-contact population died within a century. The aftermath was colonization, forced labor, the transatlantic slave trade, which transported approximately 12.5 million Africans to the Americas over 4 centuries, under conditions of extraordinary brutality, to work the plantations that made European powers enormously wealthy. The exchange of crops went both ways. Potatoes, tomatoes, maize, chili peppers, cacao, all from the Americas, transformed European and Asian diets. The potato, in particular, enabled population growth in Europe. The Columbian Exchange, as historians call it, reshuffled agriculture, diets, economies, and populations across the entire globe. The world was now connected, for good and for ill. Part 6. The Great Acceleration. By the 1700s, a new question was in the air. What is the nature of the world, and how do we know? The Enlightenment, that great intellectual movement of 17th and 18th century Europe, insisted on reason, evidence, and the rights of individuals over the authority of tradition, kings, and priests. John Locke argued that governments derived their authority from the consent of the governed, and that when they failed to protect natural rights, revolution was justified. These were not just philosophical ideas, they were political dynamite. In 1776, the American Declaration of Independence echoed Enlightenment principles directly. In 1789, the French Revolution exploded across Europe, toppling a monarchy and sending shockwaves through every royal court on the continent. The idea that political systems were not fixed by God or nature, that they were human inventions that could be changed, was arguably the most destabilizing political idea in human history. At the same time, in the coal-blackened towns of northern England, something else was beginning. The Industrial Revolution. For almost all of human history, the fundamental energy source was muscle, human or animal. Wind and water helped, but the primary limit on what humans could produce was the physical strength available to do the work. Steam changed that. The steam engine, developed and refined by James Watt in the 1760s and 1770s, could convert the chemical energy stored in coal into mechanical work on a previously impossible scale. A single steam engine could do the work of hundreds of horses, tirelessly around the clock. Factories replaced cottage industry. Cities swelled as people moved from farms to urban manufacturing. In 1800, roughly 3% of the world's population lived in cities. By 1900, it was approaching 15%. By 2007, for the first time in human history, more than half of all people on Earth lived in urban areas. The pace of change accelerated in ways that were genuinely disorienting to people living through it. In 1800, moving a person or a message faster than a horse was essentially impossible over long distances. By 1850, railroads connected major cities. By 1870, telegraph lines crossed continents and oceans. By 1900, telephones existed, electricity was entering homes, and automobiles were beginning to appear. A person born in 1800 who lived to 1900 witnessed more technological change in a single lifetime than had occurred in the previous 1,000 years. Medicine transformed. In 1800, the germ theory of disease didn't exist. Most diseases were attributed to bad air or imbalances in the body. Surgery was agonizing and almost always fatal due to infection. By 1900, Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch had established germ theory. Antiseptics and anesthesia had transformed surgery. Vaccines for smallpox, rabies, and other diseases existed. Life expectancy in wealthy countries climbed from around 35 to 40 years in 1800 to over 70 by the mid-20th century, driven primarily not by medicine, but by clean water, sewage systems, and better nutrition. The 20th century brought both the greatest achievements and the greatest catastrophes in human history. 2 world wars killed tens of millions of people. The Holocaust demonstrated what organized industrial violence could accomplish. Totalitarian regimes in the Soviet Union, China, Cambodia, and elsewhere killed tens of millions more. And then, at the end of World War II, humans split the atom. For the first time, a species had created a weapon capable of ending civilization, or possibly the species itself. The Cold War that followed was, among other things, a decades-long negotiation with that possibility. But the same century produced the Green Revolution, agricultural advances that prevented what seemed like inevitable mass starvation as population grew, penicillin and other antibiotics, vaccines that nearly or entirely eliminated polio and smallpox, the mapping of DNA, the Internet, human population, which had taken all of history to reach 1 billion by 1800, hit 2 billion by 1927, 4 billion by 1974, and 8 billion by 2022. The speed of change is now so fast that predicting even 20 years ahead has become nearly impossible. Part 7. The Ancient Brain in a Modern World. Here's the twist. Biologically, we are still hunter-gatherers. Our brains evolved over hundreds of thousands of years in small groups, dealing with immediate physical threats and immediate social dynamics. The human brain has not meaningfully changed in the last 10,000 years, certainly not in the last 200. But the world we live in has. We evolved to detect threats, which is why bad news captures our attention far more than good news. This was adaptive when threats were physical and immediate, a rustle in the grass, a rival group's approach. It's less helpful when the threats are political headlines, social media arguments, and global crises we can track in real time but do little about. We evolved for status hierarchies in small groups, which means we are exquisitely sensitive to how we rank relative to those around us. Put us in a world where social media exposes us to the most beautiful, successful, and wealthy people on Earth simultaneously, and our ancient status monitoring systems go haywire. We evolved to trust people who look and act like us, and to be cautious of those who don't. In a world of global migration, multicultural cities, and instant communication with people across the planet, these ancient instincts create real friction. We evolved for immediate rewards. Eat the food now, rest when you can. The concept of sacrificing present pleasure for distant future benefit requires us to consciously override instincts that were adaptive for most of our history. None of this is destiny. Humans are extraordinarily flexible. We learn. We build institutions and technologies to work around our limitations. We can consciously choose to act against our instincts. But understanding where those instincts come from helps explain a great deal of modern behavior that otherwise seems irrational. Technology amplifies everything: our creativity, our cooperation, our conflicts, our compassion, our cruelty. The same platforms that connected activists during the Arab Spring spread genocidal propaganda in Myanmar. The same networks that allow scientists to collaborate globally allow misinformation to spread at the speed of a click. Technology doesn't make us better or worse. It makes us more. For the first time, humans are shaping the planet at a geological scale. We've burned enough fossil fuels to measurably change the composition of the atmosphere. We've fished the oceans down to fractions of their historical abundance. We've driven species to extinction at rates comparable to the great mass extinctions of deep geological time. Geologists are now debating whether to formally designate a new geological epoch, the Anthropocene, defined by the global signature of human activity in the rock record. We have become a geological force. This is unprecedented. No single species in the nearly 4 billion-year history of life on Earth has transformed the planet's systems at anything like this speed. It is, by any measure, remarkable. Ending. The unfinished story. Human history is not a story of perfection. It is a story of adaptation, of organisms with Stone Age brains building spacecraft and global supply chains, getting much of it wrong, learning, trying again, of solving problems and creating new ones, of small choices that cascaded into world-changing consequences that no one predicted, from fires in the dark, where our ancestors sat and told stories to make sense of a dangerous world, to cities of light visible from space. From the first scratched marks on clay tablets to a global network of information that touches almost every human being on Earth. What this history reveals, above all, is that nothing was inevitable. Agriculture wasn't inevitable, cities weren't inevitable, democracy wasn't inevitable, the scientific revolution wasn't inevitable, human rights weren't inevitable. Every one of these things was invented by people in specific places at specific times for specific reasons. They could have not happened. In many cases, they almost didn't. Every system we live under was designed by humans. Every rule was chosen. Every institution was built, which means they can be changed. History doesn't tell us what will happen. It shows us what can happen. It shows us that catastrophic collapses are possible, and that recovery is possible too. That ideas can change the world faster than armies. That small groups of determined people have, repeatedly, altered the course of civilization. The story of humanity is not finished. It is being written now, today, in decisions that seem small and choices that seem local, in labs and parliaments and living rooms and protests and conversations. Understanding this history doesn't just tell us where we've been. It reminds us that the story is still ours to shape. We are still holding the pen.